Welcome to Highline Excel 2016 class video number 26. Hey, if you want to download this Excel file, Business 218 Video 26, or the PDF files, click on the link below the video. Hey, in this video, we want to talk about macro recorder basics. Now, what is a macro? A macro actually is a synonym that means code, which means VBA. That's the name of the coding you're allowed to do in Excel, Visual Basic Application. And you can either type it out in the VBA editor or use the macro recorder. Now, I am not a VBA coder. I really don't know how to type out code. And if you really want the full power of Excel, you should learn how to type out Visual Basic. But for most of us, we're not coders, so we're going to see this amazing feature, the macro recorder. Now, the macro recorder is like a tape recorder. We'll simply click the macro record button. And as we do stuff in Excel, it will write the code for you. Now, for us non-coders, and even for coders, there's two basic reasons that VBA Code is so amazing. It allows us to automate repetitive tasks. And as an example, I want to go over to M1.1. Here's a report that we get every single week. It's exactly the same. And we need to add a couple extra columns with formulas and format it. That's a repetitive task. We can simply turn on the macro recorder, create our formulas, format it, turn off the button, and then next month when we get this report, we simply go to our list of macros, click it, and it will do all the steps for us. In fact, the first time that we do this together, when we actually run the macro, it is amazing to see. Now let's go back over to topics. Now the second thing that code allows you to do is accomplish tasks where there is no built-in feature to accomplish that task. For example, if we go over to the M4 sheet, I want a function that can simply look at a number and spell out the words as if it was written out on a check. Well, this one is not going to work with a macro recorder. So the second thing we'll do in this class is we'll actually search for VBA code online, and we'll learn how to paste it into Excel and then use it. So this is an example where the macro recorder will not work, and there's not a built-in feature to take a number and convert it into words. Back over to topics. So for us non-code writers, there's still some amazing things we can do with VBA code. Now let's go through some of the short notes. The PDFs have more notes, but we have to go through a couple of important things. For example, we need to show the developer ribbon. When you open up Excel for the first time, the developer ribbon is not open. And that's where we can click a bunch of buttons for our recorder and use some VBA related things. So I'm going to go to any ribbon and right click, customize, not quick access toolbar, but customize the ribbon. Once I come over to my ribbons, here's all my ribbons. And by default, it comes not checked. So we simply check developer. Now we click OK. And there's our developer ribbon. Now before we look at a few things in this ribbon, the second most important thing is we must use .excelisfun. Now, we've talked about this in the prerequisite class and earlier in this class. The M means macro. So you could see up here in my title bar, it says .excelisfun. If I use the keyboard for save as, F12. You absolutely have to see Excel macro enable workbook.excelisfun. Sometimes you don't have your settings set to see the extension, but make sure down here in save as type, it says Excel macro enabled workbook. But you can't run code unless there's an M on the end. Or sometimes you want to go to .xls. That was in the old days. That either can have code or not have code. Now I'm going to click Escape, Escape. Now let's look a little bit through our developer ribbon. Here's the button to get to the VBA editor. If I click this button, here's the VBA editor. I'm going to close it. The keyboard is Alt F11. And we'll come back to this VBA editor later. I'm going to close this. Over here, here's our list of macros. If we click this, and you can see there's a keyboard Alt F8. So I'm going to use the keyboard Alt F8. This is where our list of macros will be. When you download this workbook, Test 01 macro will not be there. It will be empty. Escape. There's our record a macro button, and we'll use that in a little bit. Also, if you've ever wondered, down here in the status bar, right there, that button, which we'll use a few times, that will start the macro recorder also. We'll learn about the relative reference button. That's very important. And macro security. We want to click this and look at this. Now, I have it on a very dangerous setting, enable all macros. Remember, the original reason that Microsoft created .xlsx, which doesn't allow macros, and .xlsm, which does allow macros, is sometimes someone might send you some malicious code. So that's pretty dangerous. We want to actually disable all macros with notification. That means we get a warning at the beginning that allows us to either enable macros or not enable macros. So I'm going to set that macro setting and click OK. Now, here's our list of 6 different macros that we are going to do. Let's go over to the sheet M1.1, and we're going to click it. Now, here's our first macro we're going to record. But before we talk about this, we need to come over to the code group in the developer ribbon and talk about use relative reference button. Now, notice it's not selected, and when I click it, it turns gray. Now, this says use relative references, but guess what? It's nothing like cell references in formulas, nothing to do with relative and absolute. What it means is, how does the cursor move when the macro recorder is turned on? Now, if use relative reference is not gray, that means we're in absolute mode. And watch this. If the recorder is on, when I click in cell D1, back in the code it says, please select cell D1. But if the use relative reference button is on, and it's gray like that, when I click one cell to the right in E1, it did not record select E1. It actually said, please offset from the selected cell and add 1 column. So that button will become very important as we record our macros. Now I'm going to turn it off. Now in our first example, here it is. Absolute reference macro, format report that always has the same number of rows and columns. So for us, if we're clicking in D1 and copying a formula down, because the actual number of rows are set, we want to use absolute cell reference. That means when we select E1, we absolutely want to select cell E1 and then copy it through the range E2 all the way to E11. All right, now we're going to try our first recorded macro. And remember, our goal is to add a couple columns and format. Then next week, when we get a similar report with a similar structure, always the same 11 rows, we'll simply click a button and we'll automatically format. Now let's go ahead and try this. There is our record macro button. I'm going to click on it. And here's the record macro dialog box. We always want to give it a smart name. I'm going to name it Format Report Fixed Size. Now we can assign a keyboard to this. And I'm actually going to assign Control-Shift-A. But what you want to do is with your cursor right there, hold Shift and then A. So now to enact this macro, we'll do Control-Shift-A. Now we have a choice to either store it in Personal Macro Workbook, a new workbook, or this workbook. You want to store macros that you're going to use many times in many different workbooks in Personal Macro Workbook. That is a hidden workbook that always opens when you open your version of Excel on your computer. And we'll take a look at it later. And then we want to give it a description. All right, so the description, add 2 columns with formulas and format report that always starts in cell A1 and has the same number of columns and rows. Now, when you click OK, it records everything you do, including any mistakes. So when you're learning how to do record macros, sometimes you make some mistakes. You just want to stop it and delete it, and we'll see where to delete it and start over. All right, I'm going to click OK. All right, now I'm first going to select cell D1 and type the name, change, Control-Enter, Control-B. What happened there was it selected cell D1, it added the word change, and it added bold. Now I'm going to click in cell D2. Remember, this is an absolute macro. And we'll look at the code later, and we'll see that it actually uses the range function. It says, range, please select D2. Now I want to do my formula. equals, and I'm always going to take the end asset value, and I'm going to subtract the begin asset value. Now, when we go and look at the code, you'll see that the code underneath does not record cell references like this, but we'll take a look. Now, I'm going to enter this with Control-Enter because I want to keep that cell selected. And now I want to copy it down. Now, when I double-click and send it down, on the surface of Excel, that little trick there doesn't care how many rows there are. But in the code, it actually copied that formula from D2 to D11. The code we're creating right now would not work if we had a variable number of rows in our data set. All right? Remember, this is all absolute. So now when I'm clicking in cell E1, it's recording E1. I'm going to type %change, Control-Enter, Control-B. Down in the code, it put that into cell E1. Now I'm going to click in cell E2 and do the formula. Equals the amount of the change divided by the begin asset value. Now I'm going to enter this formula into cell E2. I want to format it. So I'm going to go up to Home, down to the drop down, and percentage with 2 decimals. Now I'm going to double click and copy this exactly through the range E2 to E11. Now I'm going to highlight the whole report and add all borders. Now, I haven't clicked the stop yet. And before I do, I don't want to keep it selected like this. I always want my cursor to end up in cell F1. So I'm going to select there. Now I can come up to Developer and click Stop, or I can come down to the status bar and click it down here. I'm going to click Stop. Now, here, let's go and try this. Notice M12, it has exactly the same report. Now, when we get this report each month, the amounts will be different, right? But let's try this. What's the keyboard? Now, wait a second. What if you forgot the keyboard? Let's go look at our list of macros. There's the button for list of macros, or we can use Alt F8. Now, there is our macro, and it is stored in the personal.xlsb workbook there. We could click Run. We could go and look at the code with Edit. We could delete, and that's where you want to go when you mess up and you have to start over. But let's look at Options. Options is where you can come to change your keyboard. Or sometimes, like I forget to create a keyboard, and so I come here and create this. But there it is, the information about our macro. Click OK. Now, I could click Run, but I created a keyboard, so I'm going to click Cancel. And here is the big moment. I love this. Control-Shift-A, and instantly, there it is. That is like magic. So this first macro is an example of when we have a repetitive task. We want to turn the macro recorder on, record it, and then use it in the future. I also have this listed a few times, so M1.3. So if you mess up, you can try it again, or we can admire Control-Shift-A. I simply love that. Now, before we go look at our next macro, let's go look at the code. You can either come up to the Macros button, or you can do Alt F8. And with your macro selected, you can say Edit. Now watch this. This is polite. Because it's in the hidden personal workbook, it says cannot edit macro in a hidden workbook. Unhide the workbook using the unhide command. So let's go see where that is. I'm going to click Escape, Escape. It's in View. Sure enough, in Window, we can click Unhide. And there it is, personal.xlsb. This is an Excel workbook that specifically is hidden in every version of Excel and holds the macros that you want to run universally on your particular computer. This does not follow you around. If you have this on your home computer, it doesn't follow you around to work. You can certainly open it and copy the code and bring it to work. Hey, I'm going to click OK. And now notice also something. We talked earlier, .xlsm is one extension that allows code. .xls, and of course, .xlsb also allows code. But here it is, the personal. There's nothing here. We simply want to look at the macros. So developer macros or Alt F8. And then we can click Edit. And sure enough, there it is. Now I'm going to close this. Certainly, by all means, we can click Visual Basics to go and look, or use the keyboard Alt F11. Now, over on the left, it says Module 1, which is inside the VBA project personal.xlsb. So this sort of looks like Windows Explorer. Over here, there's the code that was recorded. Now, there's a few other things here, like solver and this other .xlam, which are add-ins, and then there's our workbook. Now, let's take a look at this code. At the top, it says sub for subroutine. There's what we named our macro. These little apostrophes mean we can write notes. Those are the notes that we added, in essence, through our dialog box. Here's all the code, and when we come to the end, it says end sub. Now, we're not going to look through all of this, but let's definitely take a look at some of this. There it is, our very first action, range.select cell D1. So that's because we had absolute reference turned on. Then selection formula, R1C1. That actually is how in VBA we record cell references. Now, that's kind of a generic beginning to what we put in the cell. And in this case, it was text. Then selection got bold equals true. Then we did another absolute selection in D1. And watch this, selection.formula R1C1. That, again, is the generic description we put before we put something in a cell. And look at that. There's our formula. Now, in VBA, they don't use letters for columns and numbers for rows. They always use row and column. And if there is a number in square brackets, it means where to move relative to the actual selected cell. So notice we're in the same row for this formula, but the column means subtract one column. Remember, our cell references was the end amount, which was 1 to my left. And then we subtracted same row, but we went from the left and subtracted 2 columns to get the begin amount. So this type of notation is the notation you'll see when a formula is recorded. Remember, we said 1 cell to the left, subtract 2 cells to the left. This sort of range, like we saw here and here, that's when we select a cell. Now, that was our first formula. Then when we copied it down, it hard-coded it into the range D2 to D11. That wouldn't work if we had a variable height report. And in our next example, we'll see how to avoid that bit of code there. And then our next task was to select E1, put percentage change, bold. Then we selected E2. There's our formula. We formatted it. Then we hard-coded it down when we copied it. Then, when we get down to select the entire range right here, all of this code was simply for adding outside borders. That's one drawback to using the macro recorder, is it does record a lot of extra code. And then our final act was to select cell F1. Remember, that's from our absolute reference being on. And then we ended our sub. Now, we have this module inside our XLSB. Later, here is our workbook. When I open this up later, when we record a macro and store it in this workbook, it will be stored in our module folders. And later, we'll see that it will be module 2. In fact, our next macro recorder example, I'm going to close the VBA editor with this X up at the top. Now, we definitely want to hide our .xlsb. We're not going to need to open this again because that's our only macro we'll be recording here. I'm going to click hide, and there it's hidden. Now, let's go over to the next macro, m2.1. Now, this is a different situation. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4 rows. If we go over to m2.2, we have 6 rows. And then over on m2.3, we have a bunch of rows. So we want our macro to work no matter how many rows there are. I'm going to come back to m2.1. And I just want to think about how we could trick the macro recorder into not recording a certain fixed number of cells when we copy a formula. We're going to do something like this. I'm going to create the formula equals end asset minus begin asset, Control Enter. I'm going to copy it, and we're thinking like the macro recorder is turned on. Notice absolute references are turned on. And even if I click right here, remember, every data set's going to have at least one record, right? But now we're going to use a keyboard to jump down to the bottom of the column. If I were to click like this, it would say C5. But instead, if I use Control down arrow, the actual code records go down to the bottom of the current range, which means it keeps looking until it finds an empty cell and jumps back. Now, this is where we have to think creatively. Remember, our goal is to copy this all the way down. So instead of clicking in cell D5, now I'm going to turn on Use Relative References. Now, this means relative. So now when I click in what looks like D5, that's not what's going to be recorded in the code. It actually says, please offset and add one column. So notice the combination of Control down arrow, it won't matter where it goes. When it does its next step, because we have this turned on, it'll always add one column and be in the correct cell. Now we're going to use a keyboard to jump up. No matter how far up it is, we can use Control-Shift-Up arrow. That did not say select D2 to D5. It says go up and select all the way to the top of the next current range, which means the first item that it found. And now we can Control-V. That's how we're going to trick our macro recorder. Now I'm going to delete all this, turn off relative reference button. Now our second recorded macro, we're going to create absolute and relative reference macro. Yes, we're going to use both of them. We're going to switch back and forth while we're recording the macro to format report that has an unknown number of rows. Now I'm going to start by selecting G1. All right, here we go. We can either use the record button up here or down on our status bar. I'm going to click the one on the status bar. It opens up the same record macro dialog box. We're going to give it a smart name. Remember, this name shows up in that list. So we need to clearly know from the name what this does. Format report with variable height. I'm going to add the keyboard Shift-S. So now I have Control-Shift-S. I do not want this one in the personal, although I probably would want this one if I was going to use it over and over. But I'm going to record this in this workbook. So when you download the finished version, at least the code will be in this workbook. By the way, the code that I earlier saved in the personal is not stored in this workbook. I'm going to give it a good description. Format weekly report, where we need to add 2 columns with formulas and format it. We do not know the number of rows, and therefore we will record an absolute and relative reference macro. Now we're going to click OK, and anything we do once we click OK is recorded. All right, the very first thing I'm going to do is notice we have our absolute reference on. I'm clicking in cell D1. Typing change, Control-Enter, Control-B. That absolutely went into cell D1. This formula will absolutely go into cell D2 equals end amount minus begin amount. Control-Enter. I'm going to copy it with Control-C. I'm going to use my left arrow, but remember the macro recorder said please select C2. Now I'm going to use the keyboard Control down arrow to jump down to the bottom of the current region. Control down arrow. Now I need to come up and turn on. We're switching from absolute to relative. Now when I either click or use my right arrow, underneath the code said offset from the selected cell and add 1 column. Now I'm going to use the keyboard Control-Shift-Up arrow and then Control-V. Now I'm going to turn this off, relative reference. Now I do not want to, like in the last example, select with my cursor like this. I want to use the keyboard to highlight the current region, all of it, which is Control asterisk on the number pad. That's why earlier in the class, I always taught you Control asterisk when we're selecting the table, because that's a different line of code than Control A. All right, so we did Control asterisk. Now I'm going to go up to Home, All Borders. Now we could have added that extra column. We could have added some other formatting, whatever it is you want. But the key to this was that now this formula will automatically go down however many rows there are in our data set. Now we want to turn this off. I'm going to use the status bar button down here. Now it is stopped. Now let's go test it. Let's go to M2.2. Notice this is a different number of rows. I'm going to try it. Control-Shift-S. You got to be kidding. Now, I made an error there because I really wanted to actually select the cell over here. So let's go look at the code a little bit and see if we can change it, even though we're not coders. I'm going to use Alt F11 to go straight to the VBA editor, Alt F11. Now I can see here is our workbook. Down here, there's module folder and our second module. I'm going to double click that, And here's all the code. Now let's go through and look at this. Select D1, change, bold. Select D2, there's our formula. Copy, that's the line for copy. Select cell D2, and there it is. We didn't go down to whatever that bottom cell was. Here's the line of code for control down arrow. Go down to the bottom of the current range, and there it is, active cell offset. No rows, but we added one column. Now, this little bit is something that's added in with a macro recorder. It doesn't mean anything for us. It's the offset part of it that will add one column and move the cursor one to the right. And there it is, range selection dot end XL up dot select. That's when we did Control Shift up arrow, and then we paste it. Select the current region. That was our Control asterisk. And then here's all of our borders. Now, down at the bottom, right before end sub, we really needed to select that E1. So watch this. I'm just going to cheat. I'm going to copy this little bit of code up here, Control C. Come down after before end sub, enter, up arrow, and Control V. And now I'm simply going to change inside to E1. Now Control S to save it. Close the VBA editor. Now let's go to the next sheet. You ready? Control Shift S. That is awesome. We have created a recorded macro and even edited it a little bit to add a column with formula and format it for a variable height report. Now we want to go look at our next example here on M31. Now in this example, we have records, but notice they are listed vertically. And we would like to, of course, convert them into a proper data set. Now, I already have the field names here, but this is a repetitive task that would involve copying, clicking, paste special transpose, so it converts from vertical to horizontal, deleting the rows, and then copying the next one. Anytime we have a repetitive task like this, if we turn the macro recorder on the first time, then turn it off, then we can simply run that macro and get all of the records much more quickly than doing it manually. Now, this one's going to involve relative cell references all the way. And I'm going to make sure to have the very first cell in the record selected. That means when I turn off the macro, my cursor has to be in the next record. All right, I'm going to select the first cell in the first record. All right, we're going to turn on the macro recorder. Developer, there's our record macro. Here's the dialog box. I'm going to give it a smart name. Convert vertical records to a proper data set. I'm going to assign the keyboard Control Shift Z. So I'm holding Shift and typing a Z. I definitely want it in this workbook. This is a great example of a one-time macro you'd want to use. I'm going to give it a good description. Convert vertical records to proper data set using a relative reference macro. When I click OK, that's the first thing I'm going to do is come up and click Use Relative References. So I see that it's gray. Now I can start. Now I already have that cell selected, the first cell on the record. So now I'm going to use the keyboard Control Shift down arrow. That assures that we'll always go down to the last cell right before the empty cell between the next record. Now I can copy. Notice the active cell is right there. So because I have relative reference turned on, when I click one cell above, it will offset subtracting one row. Now I can home, paste special transpose. Now the active cell is right there. And what I really want to do is delete the 9 rows below. So with relative reference turned on, I'm going to highlight number 3 row header and click and drag all the way down to 11. Really, it will always delete the 9 rows below because we have relative reference turned on. Right click, delete. Now, the empty cell between the horizontal record and the next vertical record is the active cell. So now when I click one below, it offsets and adds 1 row. That's it. I'm ready to stop. I'm going to come down to the status bar and click Stop. Now I'm already ready. I can try my keyboard, Control Shift Z. You got to be kidding me, Control Shift Z. Now I'm simply going to hold the Control and Shift key down and tap the letter Z, 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 Z. And there, after a few times, I have converted all of those vertical records into horizontal records. Now let's go look at the code. Alt F8 to look at the list of macros. There's my 3 macros. I can certainly see there's my macro. I can click Edit. Over here, I still have the same module 2. It has the first macro and the second one. Now notice this isn't that much code. It says range selection and that selection.end Excel down. That's when we did Control Shift down arrow. Then we copied. Then we offset subtracting 1 row. And then look at that. Paste special transpose equals true. Then we went offset by adding a row. And there's the 9 rows below. Down here is the delete. And finally, we needed to select the first cell in the next record. So we offset added 1 row. That is pretty amazing. I'm going to close this. If you want to try it on the next sheet, it still works here. Control Shift Z, Z. All right, so that's 3 recorded macros to automate tasks. And we saw relative and absolute references. Now we want to go over to M4. Now our goal on this sheet is to create words as if we were filling out a check for each one of these numbers. Now there's no built-in feature to do this, and we certainly can't use the macro recorder, but we can go search for VBA code online. Let's go ahead and open up a browser. I went ahead and typed in Excel VBA spell out numbers as Word into Google, and we get a bunch of links. And Microsoft sometimes has really good code. So this first link, how to convert numeric value to English words in Excel, is going to do the trick. Let's scroll down here, and it's polite. It reminds us we have to open Excel, use Alt F11 to get to the Visual Basic Editor, insert a module, which we will do, and then it says type this out. Well, we're not going to type it. I'm simply going to highlight and copy all the way down to end function, because this will add an actual new function for us. Control C, Alt Tab, Alt F11 to open up VBA Editor. We go up to Insert and Module. And just like that, we could see Module 3 inside our folder, which is inside our Excel workbook. Now I come over to the white. On the right, Control V, and that's it. There will be a new function called spell number. Control S. I can actually use Alt F4, which closes the active window. And now I come over, equals SP, and there it is, spell number tab. I click on the cell that contains the number, relative cell reference, Control Enter, double click and send it down. That is so cool. $64,537.23. $1 and no cents. Hey, let's go over to M5 and look at another example. What if I wanted to add in this cell based on whichever color I put here? That means I would need to add the 4, the 5, and the 4. Well, let's go over and search for some code that will add or count red cells. Excel add, count red cells. There's actually tons of different VBA code online for this. So we could click through and try a bunch of different ones. I'm going to go to this one right here, Able Bits. And here it is. This one is going to be quite amazing. Here's the code. I'm going to highlight all of this all the way down to end function, Control C. It's actually going to add a couple different formulas. Count cells by color, sum cells by color. I'm going to use Alt Tab to jump back over here. Alt F11, insert a new module. And there it is, Module 4. I come over here, Control V. You're kidding me. There's a bunch of different ones. The one we're going to try is count cells by color and sum cells by color. Control S, Alt F4 to close that window, equals count. And there it is, count cells by color. We want by color. Now you got to read over there at the website. It says highlight the entire range, comma. And then I'm going to select the cell with the color. I'm going to click in cell E1 and down arrow. When I hit enter, just like that, it's counted 1, 2, 3. If I do equal sum, I'm going to sum cells by color, tab. Highlight the entire range. comma. And now I can simply click on this cell, close parentheses, and enter. And there it is. It's adding 13. Now, if I change the color, I'm going to have to recalculate the sheet, which is formulas. And I can come over to calculate now, or I can use the keyboard Control-Shift-Alt F9, which recalculates everything. Or simply F9, which was the keyboard we saw up here, F9. And sure enough, now we have 2 cells and a total of 10. So simply being able to Alt F11 and having the ability to insert a module opens up amazing possibilities if you can search for code using a browser or in forms. If you go to like mrexcel.com/form and ask for something, you may get code back. So being able to insert a module is pretty helpful. All right, I'm going to close this. We have one more example, and I'm going to go to the sheet M6. And simply what we want to do here is enter a record and then click a button, which will be called a form control button, and have it added to the bottom of this data set. Now, this solution requires that we have at least one record in our data set. But let's go over here. I'm going to enter a record. So I've entered this record. So what I want to do is highlight the record, copy it, paste it down at the bottom. But notice this is a variable height table. So we're always going to click in cell A1 and then use the keyboard control down arrow and then switch over to our use relative references and then offset 1 and paste. Then we're going to go back and clear it for the next record. And I'm going to start the macro assuming that our cursor can be anywhere. Our first step will be to highlight absolutely A2 to D2. Now I'm going to turn off relative references. Now let's record a new macro. So I called it move new record to proper data set. And the description down here, move new record to bottom of proper data set on sheet name proper data set. Now I'm not going to add a keyboard here because we're going to actually add the code to a button that the user can click. And we definitely want it in this workbook. Click OK. Now we have it as absolute, so I'm going to highlight the range A2 to D2, Control-C to copy, click on proper data set. I want to click in cell A1, Control down arrow, and now I'm going to use relative references and click one below, Control-V. Now our next step is I always want to have the cursor at the very bottom of the data set. So notice relative references on. That's the active cell. So now I click one below. Now I'm going to turn this off. Now we're going to go back over to M6, and I want to delete. Highlight the range and delete, and then click in the very first cell. Now I'm going to click Stop Recording. Now let's go look at our macro. I'm going to open up the list with Alt F8. There's our macro. Click Edit. Down here you can see range. We selected it. We copied it. We went over to the sheet proper data set, selected A1. Select and then .end XL down, offset, add one row, then we pasted. Then we, of course, offset 1 to select the cell at the bottom of the data set. Then we went back to the sheet M6, selected that range, cleared the contents, and selected A2. I'm going to go ahead and close this. Now we can go up to Developer, and in Controls, click the Insert dropdown, and we want Form Control Button. Now I see a little very thin crosshair. I'm going to click and drag, and we'll get to do two things. We'll be able to assign a macro, and I want Move New Record to Proper Data Set. And now click OK. This next step is we want to add some text. So I'm going to highlight Button 1. Click to move record to bottom of data set on sheet proper data set. Now I'm going to click over to the side, and we have to add a new record. So we have our record. When I click this, instantly we can see it's cleared. And if we go over to the proper data set, the record was added to the bottom, and the cell directly below was added. Wow, that was an amazing video for those of us who are non-code writers of how to use relative and absolute references up here and the recorded macro feature. We saw how to take a record and add it to a proper data set. Over on M5, we saw how to add and count by color. On M4, we saw this great function spell number to take a number and convert it to words. In both cases, 4 and 5, we got the code from the internet. Then on M3-1, we saw how to use a straight relative reference macro to move vertical records to horizontal. And then on M2, we created a macro to format a report and add a column with formulas for variable height using relative and absolute. And all the way back on M1, we flat out added 2 formula columns in formatting for a report that always has the same number of rows and columns. Wow, that is the last video in the Highline class series. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot. We'll see you next video series.